Good afternoon and welcome back to the Batuta Advocate radio show. My name is Errol Parker. This afternoon we are going to revisit the podcast we recorded a few weeks ago with Hedley Thomas, the creator behind the Teacher's Pet podcast. We're going to revisit this afternoon because in case you haven't already seen in the news, the subject of the Teacher's Pet podcast, Chris Dawson, is set to be extradited from Queensland to New South Wales, where he is expected to be charged with the murder of his former wife, Lynette Dawson. So without further ado, we felt it pertinent to revisit this podcast in light of recent events. Enjoy.
You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate on Desert Rock FM. Well, here we are with Hedley Thomas, Australian investigative journalist, the researcher and reporter and voice behind the new podcast, Teacher's Pet. First Aussie podcast to go number one in the US, 10 million downloads. Hedley, did you think you were going to get this much of a following behind the story that you've been following?
No, I was worried it was going to be a big fail.
Yeah.
I wanted to tell the story over a number of episodes, but I didn't know how to make a podcast.
Yeah.
And when I first wrote the script for it, I think it was pretty ordinary. And then I think just, people started realising there was a terrible injustice at the heart of the story. And maybe they were interested also in hearing, behind the scenes what happens when a journo, gets transfixed in a yarn and starts following it and talks to all sorts of people connected to it. And we had some, really good material, but we had, I think, the authenticity of members of Lynn Dawson's family, and you could identify with them, and their loss. And people had lots of questions, and we tried to answer as many as possible. And a series that was, maybe going to be 6 or 8 episodes ended up becoming 14. And it was 10 million downloads a while back, but I think it's 17 now. And,
right.
Yeah.
So just for the 9 people in this country who haven't heard it, what's the Teacher's Pet about?
Yeah, it revolves around a mum called Lynn Dawson, who was 33 when she disappeared from her home up at Bayview on Sydney's northern beaches. And she was a mother of 2 little girls, aged 4 and 2, and she was married to Chris Dawson, and he's an identical twin. His brother Paul Dawson and Chris played first grade rugby league for the Newtown Jets through the 70s. They were pin-up footballers for Eastern Suburbs before then in rugby union, and they modelled, and they were school teachers.
Yeah.
And really popular, charismatic guys in the high schools on the northern beaches. They were heartthrobs, and they were also quite predatory with schoolgirls.
They had that creepy twins thing going on as well, identical.
Well, that was one of the features of this story. They were exceptionally close.
Yeah.
People who talked to me about Chris and Paul, who got to know them pretty well, played football with them, lived next door to them, said, look, they'd known lots of twins, but they'd never known twins like Chris and Paul in terms of the closeness of their relationship.
Yeah.
And it was that close that they actually enjoyed having sex with a female together. Which
which
imagine,
is exceptionally close.
Well, having sex with someone with your sibling, is weird.
Yeah. And that's just kind of scraping the surface on these guys, really, isn't it? It's just the more you go into this story, the more you find out, and more you realise that they were capable of. Now, there's so many elements to this story that actually appeal to a wider audience, and it's quite nostalgic when you think about that puberty blues era, with the heartthrob teachers, everyone's living on the beach, and then there's the rugby league element of back in New South Wales rugby league. Did you find that there was a little bit of glory days about these some of these characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a trip down memory lane for a lot of people, me included. I'm 51. I went to Gold Coast High School, and in 1984 I finished Year 12. In 1982, Lynn Dawson suddenly vanished, and so for a lot of people, being taken back to their school days is really nostalgic and interesting. But it also coincided with events that in Australian history were amazing. And during the investigation research phases for the Teacher's Pet, and when I was putting together one episode in particular which dealt with Lynn Dawson's final 7 days before, I believe she was murdered in her home at Bayview. And, I was looking for events that were occurring around that time. And, in addition to, that famous test with the Windies, you also had the Azaria Chamberlain case.
Yeah, right.
And I heard that grab again with Lindy Chamberlain saying, a dingo took my baby. And I hadn't heard it for years, and I really think that when you hear that and when you haven't heard it for ages, it's one of those comments, those grabs that, is, it can be pretty moving, actually.
Yeah, particularly seeing what ended up happening with that whole thing, because I guess that grab, when it first came into everyone's, peripheral, was a bit of a joke, and then we saw more and more coming out of that whole thing. Do you find that might have been a bit similar with this family, with the Dawsons? Do you feel like there was a lot of dismissiveness at the start?
I think it's sort of actually kind of in reverse, in that with the Lindy Chamberlain case, many Australians rushed to judge and condemn her, and I think believe that she was the murderer of her daughter, her baby girl, and her appearance and her religiousness and other things no doubt influenced that. Whereas I think when Lynn disappeared, Chris Dawson should have been suspected of foul play, but he was, in amongst a lot of his friends, it seems anyway, pitied, as if his wife had just run away and left her kids, and he had good police mates, and they looked after him. They played footy with him.
So he had a completely different look. He wasn't some spiritual hippie roaming around Uluru. He was just a stand-up ex-league player from the beaches, right?
Yeah, well, up to a point. I mean, he was a role model for many people, but he had been having an affair with one of his students from Cromer High School for the previous 14 months, leading up to when his wife just suddenly vanished. And then when she disappeared, he moved that schoolgirl. He fetched her from Southwest Rocks, where she was having like a schoolies holiday, camping trip with friends her own age, drove up there and brought her back, and she was living in the house, sleeping in Lynn's bed within, 2 days of what two coroners believe was Lynn's murder.
Yeah. So do you feel like at the time there were people thinking it's a bit funny the way were people thinking about that? Were people even talking about it, and did they even know about his relationship with these girls, or was that just part of the culture?
Yeah, this is the weird thing. So many people have told me that people on the northern beaches, that they did suspect wrongdoing, and former students of Cromer High who would who knew Mr. Dawson as the sports teacher, who knew Joanne as his girlfriend, they said that Mrs. Dawson's under the pool. She was murdered and she's buried under the swimming pool. And Lynn's friends also suspected wrongdoing. But unfortunately, the police didn't pursue, obvious kind of possible leads. They didn't go and knock on neighbours' doors. They didn't follow up with Lynn's friends, at her workplace. And Lynn's family, Lynn's brother, Greg, and another brother, Phil, and sister Pat, they lived in other parts of the state. And Lynn's mother, Helena, she lived down at Clovelly, and they weren't talking to Lynn's friends on the northern beaches. So there wasn't information sharing. I mean, these days with Facebook and mobile phone, you'd know in a heartbeat, that there was something up with this. But back then, we're talking sort of, before people even were using mobile phones.
It was picnics, really, wasn't it?
Yeah,
So you'd catch up.
yeah.
One would think you've kind of spent your lifetime on this, and I imagine you've spent a lot of time on this. What was it like? What's it like dealing with the ex-rugby league community from that era, particularly the pre-professional kind of everyone either became a cop or a teacher, a pub owner or a pokey rep? Is there a bit of a brotherhood when you're dealing with this kind of stuff there?
Yeah, there is. I was really lucky in that I had some good friends who were able to help me, get contact numbers for people like Paul Broughton. And I played a bit of rugby league, not very well, on the Gold Coast. And my sister, Rebecca, she ended up becoming chair of the Gold Coast Titans, and now is like a co-owner of that team. And so she was able to, give me a bit of a steer. And I talked to people like Matty Johns about the case and Gordon Tallis, and they were fascinated, and they were able to sort of, suggest different people I might talk to for background, and then
bit of a telegraph within them.
Yeah, it was great, and everyone remembers the Dawson twins from the 70s when they played for Newtown.
Very blonde.
Yeah, they were very handy players. I'm not a sort of rugby league tragic in that I couldn't tell you, who's who on the ladder and how that's all going, but I guess I bluffed my way through that part of it. And I think a lot of people along the way during the investigations and the interviews, they saw an opportunity so many years after the fact to solve a case that clearly had troubled them for some time. I haven't heard from anybody throughout this past 10 months who's said to me, "You've really stitched up an innocent man here." And there have been so many hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and emails and contacts and Facebook messages from people offering information. And I'm not suggesting that is, some sort of black and white barometer of the righteousness or, the likely guilt, in my view, of Chris Dawson. But I think it's really interesting that he has taught, no doubt thousands of teenagers. He's played football with hundreds of blokes, where they've really had to.
There's got to be a few people
bond
with
together.
a good egg,
Yeah, no one has said, mate, that's outrageous. He would never have done that.
Not like, so many other crimes that kind of happen.
So what have people been saying? You've had this investigation come out. It's been all in the public, and people have been writing to you. Have they been offering up anything significant to the point where there could be a reopening of the investigation?
Yeah, they have offered a lot of new information, new witnesses who didn't go forward, didn't contact police over the years, didn't talk to the two coroners who ran the inquests in 2001 and 2003. They've come forward with individually important pieces of evidence. One of the more important witnesses to come forward was a woman called Beverly Staniforth, and she was at Cromer High, and she knew Joanne, and she was good friends with Lynn and Chris Dawson because she had been babysitting in their home at Bayview and got to know the girls well, and was really fond of Chris, liked him a lot, saw him as a good man who provided for his family and easy to get along with. And that's another thing a lot of the students do say. The boundaries between Chris and Paul Dawson and the students were really significantly broken down. They wanted to be friends rather than having that kind of position of authority.
Cool teachers,
they were cool teachers. So Beverly saw what she described as really rough treatment by Chris of Lynn, and that was significant because so many other
domestically at home.
So rough shoving that made her cry, sort of pushed her into a doorway, and another time whipped her with a towel and across her back, and just in a flash of anger, and so she came forward, and she was crying when she was describing that because she felt guilty that she hadn't raised it earlier, hadn't pressed it, although she said she'd contacted Crime Stoppers, but they didn't call her back. And she also felt some guilt that she didn't prevent events, even though she couldn't have. She was a teenager, but, you know, that was all playing on her mind. So she was significant. There have been a number of others who have led me into areas where, you know, we've been able to find fresh documentation that was really, I think, you know, a tipping point in this whole case. Yeah. And one of these key documents was a handwritten statement that Chris wrote to the police in August 1982, 7 months after Lynn disappeared. And in that statement, Chris lies about, you know, some really fundamental facts. He, you know, just sort of airbrushes out of existence the fact that he was having an intense sexual relationship with Joanne Curtis. And he says that his wife, you know, was distressed and they were having problems in their marriage because, you know, she was spending a bit of money on her bank card. And he, you know, lies about the fact that he went to Queensland a couple of days before Christmas, ostensibly to start a new life with Joanne. They didn't work out. They turned back and Lynn had disappeared a fortnight later. But the omission of those key facts when he's trying to tell police, give them information, supposedly that'll help them find Lynn, you know, is very bad for his credibility in the event of a prosecution. It's known as a consciousness of guilt.
Yep.
He does. A prosecutor would argue that he lied because he knew that if he had told the truth, they would take a closer interest in what had happened and possibly charge him with murder. So that was a document that had not been known to the DPP after the first two inquests, wasn't known to earlier police investigations, and, you know, just through a bit of luck and design, flushed it out of state archives where it had been sitting with an investigation file that the state ombudsman had possession of when one of Lynn's friends complained in 1985 that the cops weren't taking the case seriously.
Right.
Yeah. So has there been any renewed interest from the authorities?
Yeah, there's significant interest. The police certainly want to charge Chris Dawson with murder. You know, the police hopelessly botched this case through the 80s, and I think...
You don't think there was a conspiracy at all? Do you think it was just... do you think it might have just been the one that slipped through incompetence? Or?
Yeah, I think it was certainly gross incompetence, but I think given some of the facts of this case... and then the complaint that one of Lynn's friends put in writing to the state ombudsman, accusing the police of not doing their jobs properly, and they still didn't do their jobs properly. I think that, you know, it's possible that it was, you know, sinister, that it was more than incompetence, but it's really difficult to prove that because the cops who were directly involved, some of them are dead, or you know, they've lost their marbles, and, you know, it's really hard to reconstruct that. But the police now, and, you know, for many years, have wanted to charge Chris Dawson with murder and other offences, including, you know, sexual abuse of...
Yeah, I guess all that stuff is sitting there as well.
Yeah, but what's held them back is the Office of the DPP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, has consistently said that there was insufficient evidence to meet their test to charge for murder. Now, there's a stronger brief of evidence. You know, I think the DPP is probably, if they apply all their usual principles, likely to agree that a prosecution should proceed. But, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, but in saying that, though, now that this is probably one of the most popular podcasts of the year, do you think you'd be able to get a jury that hasn't listened to the podcast? Yeah.
Well... yeah, I do. I think that they would just select jurors carefully and ask them, have you listened to, you know, The Teacher's Pet? And if you haven't, it's available on all good platforms. But no, they would select carefully and find the jurors who hadn't. And then there's also the option of a judge alone trial. Yeah. And I'm sure there'd be some judges who hadn't listened to it. Yeah. And I don't subscribe or buy the theory that, you know, because of a journalistic investigation, someone can't get a fair trial. I think defence lawyers like to run around and, trot that argument out willy-nilly, but usually it doesn't fly. And the High Court has consistently ruled that, a jury that has been properly instructed can certainly, in a case of great prominence, deliver justice and be fair.
Now, just quickly, before we kind of move on to, some of the other stuff you've done in your career, what is happening with the house? Who owns it now? Surely they must know how many people are waiting for them to open up their property to...
Yeah, this is a beautiful property in Gilwinga Drive, Bayview, and I was only up there the other day. Chris and Lynn built the house up there, and, it's worth $2.5 million plus. And the current owners have only been there a year, and it was going to be their retirement home. So, and they've got people who have listened to the podcast and have become pretty obsessed with the case. Like the level of interest from people who never knew Lynn and Chris, people who never been to Bayview before, and now they're doing drive-bys. The house, and so the owners, I think, have been watching this, and I've felt a lot of pity for them. I've talked to them. They'll probably see police up there digging in areas of that property that, weren't dug properly in the past, and that might yield further evidence. There was a dig in 2000 which recovered a cardigan. Lynn's neighbour, Julie Andrews, said that that was Lynn's favourite pink cardigan, and it had multiple cut marks in it consistent with stabbing. According to Bob Gibbs, who was the scientific officer on that dig, and he told me that dig concluded prematurely for budgetary reasons.
Right.
And, he said, I hadn't heard this phrase for ages. He said, we were spewing, mate. We were spewing.
Yeah.
And he said he thought it was possible that they'd missed Lynn Dawson's remains by just a few feet,
And just a few $1,000s probably as well.
Yeah. So, crazy stuff like that. And I think people hearing the episodes, and certainly for me, discovering these things, you're left shaking your head sometimes at how authorities conduct investigations or don't. And I know there are many fantastic examples of great detective work, great policing, great prosecuting, and I don't want to, generalise, but in this case, there's just been a litany of failure and disaster, incompetence, lack of disclosure. The current DPP, Lloyd Babb, who's been in that job since 2011, he was in the football team at Asquith Boys College, that was coached by Chris and Paul, and he didn't think that was something he needed to disclose to Lynn Dawson's family, and it came out in the podcast, and they were just shattered. I mean, they couldn't believe it. And it's not suggesting that Lloyd Babb has done anything untoward. That's not where I'm going at all.
It's a direct link.
But
it's a very small world.
You got to disclose that sort of stuff to ensure that people have confidence in the system.
Yeah.
Particularly when Lynn's family have been, in my view, treated so badly. Let down at every turn.
Yeah. Well, if you look up and down the charts now, on sort of more often than not, most of the podcasts which are up the top are true crime ones, and then you've got on Stan and Netflix and all of those ones, all the shows that you often see up the top there are crime related.
It's almost a renaissance that I guess you've timed with as well. It's kind of like you've been working on this forever, and you've you're in a climate now where everyone wants to know about these kind of things. Do you think that's kind of helped the interest, or?
Oh yeah, I first wrote about Lynn Dawson 17 years ago, so it was early 2001, and I was then working as a features writer for the Courier Mail in Brisbane, and the first inquest was on, and I started reading some newspaper articles about the evidence coming out in that inquest, and I thought it was just fascinating, and persuaded the boss to let me fly to Sydney, meet the cops who were involved in it, and interview some members of Lynn's family. And then I read parts of the police brief, or most of it, in one of the police stations up there on the Northern Beaches, and I wrote a big piece about it. And then, I always thought that I would revisit the case one day. I kept everything from the case in a carton in the roof of my carport at home in Brisbane. And late last year, late 2017, when I was keen to do a podcast, but didn't really know how you'd do a podcast series, and my father had died, and I was looking for some new challenge. He was always a great mentor, and kept me grounded and focused and so on.
Was he media?
No, he was a military pilot.
Right.
Yeah. He sailed, and he was quite brilliant. But he passed away, and so I had this idea that I would revisit the Lynn Dawson case and try and reinvestigate it, and maybe find new evidence that could solve it. Because, I have to be honest, I didn't start investigating this case with a completely, 50-50 view as to whether or not Chris Dawson might have been innocent.
Yeah.
If I found evidence suggesting that he was innocent, that would have been really prominent. Mm. But I agreed with the two coroners who said that he should be prosecuted for murder. And I believed that based on the evidence I'd read all those years ago and the contact that I'd had over the years with Lynn's sister, Pat. Yeah, so when that idea started to sort of take hold, I was really keen to launch and get into it. And I was really fortunate that Lynn's family remembered me. They'd kept the article all those years and trusted me to sort of tell it, but they didn't know what a podcast was, and I didn't know how to make one. And that funny little app on my iPhone, when I wanted to listen to something interesting, I'd Google BBC History podcast rather than go to the app. So it's been a bit of an accidental success.
Perfect medium for it. Now, can you just tell us, you kind of grew up, like you said, early 80s, you were finishing school down there in the Gold Coast. That was a big time for journalists as well in Queensland. You had Moonlight State. You had, in the 80s anyway, you had journalists were doing a lot more work than police were in exposing certain kind of elements, and there was a government brought down pretty much around the work of journalists. Was that kind of got into your head? Were you inspired by the Moonlight State kind of stuff that was happening there? Sir Joe Fitzgerald inquiry?
Yeah, I was. And, it was a remarkable time. I love a punt and always have. So I started going to the races when I was probably 14, 15. A mate of mine wanted to be a jockey, and so he got an apprenticeship then, and I used to help muck out stables. And so, one thing led to another. And when I was still at high school, we'd be back in the favourite and then doubling down, after jumping the fence at the Gold Coast races, and that was unlawful. We were underage. And then, in Cavill Avenue there was an illegal casino, and it had free drinks, obviously to encourage gambling. So, I would be, glad mum and dad aren't around to hear this, but I would be 16, 17 and be playing blackjack and enjoying, bourbon and Coke for free.
White shoes on.
Yeah, in this dodgy little casino above the Gelati bar in Cavill Ave. And then I became a copy boy straight out of high school at the Gold Coast Bulletin. And Chris Masters, I was initially in sport, but then Chris Masters started his work around the same time as Phil Dickey from the Courier Mail was doing his work. And, there was this incredible focus on police corruption.
The Courier Mail played a big part in that.
Played a really big part, and I was not at the Courier Mail until mid-1988, but because of those experiences with illegal casinos, and they must have been paying local cops money, I probably bandwagoned a bit and ended up pissing off all my mates by doing a story on the illegal casino. Look, it was a remarkable period, and watching police officers at really high rank go into the witness box, roll over,
Yeah.
And tell all about, the thousands of dollars that they would receive in bribes, all the way to the police commissioner, who was Sir Terence Lewis.
Yeah, they're all knighted. All those fellas were knighted.
And, it's one of the great expressions that sort of stood the test of time, because it's been 30 years, came out of Terry's mouth. And it was used to describe, according to Jack Herbert, the amounts of money that he would receive.
So that Jack Herbert was the bag man who was moving the money around from the cribs to the cops.
That's right. Yeah. He was responsible for distributing the dough, and the police commissioner, of course, would receive some of this dough. And Terry tried to take money in sort of smaller increments, but regularly, according to Jack Herbert. And Terry's explanation to Jack Herbert, if I remember this correctly, was little fish are sweet. And I just love that saying, little fish are sweet. It's when you're talking about graft but it was an era of incredible journalism. Chris Masters and Phil Dickey were brilliant, and I think it must have left a powerful impression on many journalists, myself included, wet behind the ears, very junior, but keen to emulate those journalists. And also, when you consider that the corruption, not just of the police force, but of the government in those years, had occurred when there were really good journalists working in Queensland, but somehow it had happened. I think it helped influence journalists such as myself to be more rugged, more robust, because you didn't want to have this legacy again.
The protesters were the same. The protesters were going harder than anyone else in the country. The music was everyone was kind of indirectly kind of ramped up, weren't they?
Yeah.
It and it almost is like you were almost a bit too good at your job, because then they moved you to the UK.
Yeah, I
out of everyone's hair down there in the southeast.
Yeah, I was 22, and it was mid-'89, and the editor of the Courier Mail said, "How would you like to go and work in the London bureau for News Limited?" And I was,
how old were you?
22.
Oh, perfect.
And I'd never been overseas before. Stradbroke Island was about it. And I was born in the US. I was born in Texas, but I was a very small child when I came back. And so, that was an amazing opportunity. And I thought I must have been, pretty special to have got that gig. But I was told by a couple of the guys I became mates with in the London bureau, when it was a really big bureau, that I should get a grip, that I was actually the cheapest, because I had no family to take over. There were no big houses to sort of fund. A little flat in Clapham would do it.
No school for kids, no, nothing like that.
I didn't have to go business class. They could have strapped me to the wing.
Yeah. Right, so talking to Michaela Whitbourne, Fairfax investigative journalist, we're talking about, this shit quite often. For her, she finds she's quite ruthless with the stuff she's been doing. She doesn't really think about it affecting her life. That's part of the game. If you can get exposed by journalists, then you lose, kind of thing. That was her thinking, and I think McClymont's a bit the same. Chris Masters, I know, during all that investigation was, at risk, and there was talk of intercepts of, underage kids being put in hotel rooms to kind of stitch him up and that kind of stuff. Have you ever seen people playing dirty with the stuff you've been chasing?
Yeah, I've had some nasty threats, and I didn't pay much attention to the threats, because I always figured that people who threaten weren't serious. The people who were serious, you wouldn't know about. You'd just get a bullet.
Yeah.
Open the door one day.
But then, one night we did get the bullets. And so, it was, about 16 years ago.
On the job in Queensland?
Yeah, we weren't on the job. We'd been, my wife and I were at home in bed, but I think we'd just watched Lateline and gone to bed. it was a really windy night, blowing a gale outside, and I thought that a massive branch had fallen from one of the trees outside onto the carport roof near our bedroom. Because I said, "Oh, Christ, what was that?" And Ruth said, "Oh, there's glass all over me." And just trying to compute what was going on. So I went outside, and the neighbours were outside, and they said, the car's just sped off. There've been shots fired, and the glass that was over my wife, Ruth, was the fragments from the hole in the window above our heads, where the bullet had come through and then smashed into the bathroom wall, and another 3 bullets were fired, and one went through my children's playroom. My kids were really young at that time. Another bullet, went into the roof, and another one overhead somewhere, and suddenly, it sort of brought it home. Well, who's done that? Which story did they do it over?
Yeah.
What was that about? And we never got to the bottom of it. And the police, they had a task force for some weeks or months, and looked into lots of different angles and theories. And unfortunately, while I think there were probably 3, prime suspects based on the stories I was doing at that time, there wasn't sufficient evidence for them to charge any one person, and it went unresolved. But it was a really difficult period, and it went on for a while, and I think I was probably at a bit of a crossroads afterwards, because I felt like I couldn't know whether it would happen again. And,
especially not knowing what it was over. That's not very effective if they're just saying stop working altogether.
Yeah.
Jeez, you've done a lot of different kind of stuff, from obviously from organised crime to Dr. Patel was one that you kind of, and come to think of it, were probably behind bringing that to light. I know it was in the news a lot about.
You certainly got the Walkley for it anyway.
Were you the first to scratch the top on that?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, right. And
Dr. Death.
Yeah. The nurses called him Dr. Death. Yeah, that was a remarkable yarn, and it had a long tail. But what happened was these nurses in Bundaberg were at their wits' end because they'd tried to complain to their doctor bosses and others about the new surgeon in charge at Bundaberg Base Hospital, and they weren't being heard, and they felt that the patients were being significantly harmed and sometimes dying as a result of his poor judgment, poor operation skills, and so on. And I went up there, and I met Tony Hoffman, who was the senior nurse at the hospital, and she invited some of her other colleagues over. It was at this secret meeting in her house in Bundaberg, and it was after work, so I said, look, I'll bring some food over, and I went to this Indian restaurant where Dr. Patel was one of his favourites, and I ordered half a dozen really good curries and took them over to Tony's house, and I was just floored, while we were sort of eating, they were talking about what had been going on, and they struck me as incredibly sincere, credible, consistent. It wasn't personal, it wasn't racist. They were just really worried, and they were in tears at times, describing what had gone on. It was right towards the end of the night when one of the nurses made this comment, and she said he didn't become a bad surgeon overnight. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, he's always been a bad surgeon, and he must have been a bad surgeon where he's previously practiced, and he was an American surgeon. And so I said, well, does that mean there might be kind of like a record of prior history, bad outcomes, mishaps, and so on? And she said, yes. So I went back to the motel just thinking, I bet you there's something there. I couldn't wait for the next morning to come so that I could start, digging into that. And I got a flight back to Brisbane from Bundaberg. It's not a long way to drive, but got into the office at Bowen Hills. And this was in the days when, I know it seems ridiculous now, but journalists didn't immediately do a Google search in 2005 as soon as they heard something interesting. Yeah, like now it's like,
I better Google this guy.
I met a girl in a bar, I'll Google it,
on my phone on the way.
Yeah, so I went... if I took my laptop up, it wouldn't have... probably didn't have that capability. Went back to the office, go to the desktop and started using Google, and then I found Dr. Patel's disciplinary history in this US state. It was in both New York State as well as...
it was that easy.
In Oregon, and it was there. It was online. And this was after he'd been there 2 years. He'd been hired as the director of surgery. He'd got through all the checks and balances. He'd lied his head off about his prior disciplinary history. He'd been prevented from performing surgery in the US. He had a shocking record. And he'd got through all the hoops with the Medical Board of Queensland, and all the bureaucrats had been telling me and the nurses, no, this is a witch hunt of a good doctor. And then suddenly we flush this out and away it goes. And I remember the headline, why didn't they check? And we splashed the paper that night and the next day, and I wrote a feature as well. And it was that simple. It was a Google search. I mean, I would love to say there was this really deep, intense 6-month investigation, but I thought I had to be upfront, right? Look, the right outcome was that he was discovered, and I think because people understood that it was a simple Google search that discovered this, the story became more powerful.
That's the time, right?
Yeah.
But just tell us quickly, he wasn't a phony. He was just an incredibly shit surgeon.
Look, he may have had once good skills.
Yeah.
But he had fallen foul of authorities in the US because of the outcomes from his surgery. A lot of people had been harmed.
He had studied, right?
He had studied in India and in the US, and he'd been properly qualified as a surgeon. He just it was not a good surgeon, and it became worse. And the story took me to India. It took me to Portland, Oregon, where he worked before he came to Australia, as well as to New York, because there was a Royal Commission style inquiry that the Queensland government set up into it. Peter Beattie ordered that. And then there was a huge amount of evidence of cover-ups in the whole hospital system through that process. Once the lawyers began interrogating the bureaucrats and the doctors who had become part of a system which was delivering outcomes that looked good for politicians' shiny press releases, but were not good for patient care. There was an ongoing sense of disgust that the system had been allowed to become captured by politicians who were lying about the waiting lists, how long people would really wait for procedures, outcomes. The Medical Board of Queensland, which was meant to be this sort of vetting
they've had a few claims,
process.
haven't they? Remember there was about 5 years ago was the Tahitian prince that
the money out of the health department.
And every now and then you'll find someone on the most wanted turns up in the back of Weipa working in the medical for Queensland Health. Did you find people can manipulate bureaucracy?
Well, I think people can certainly manipulate bureaucracy, because often bureaucracy is just completely inept. And one of the lessons for me as a journalist that I keep relearning is that you should always assume that the bureaucrats have completely stuffed things up. And don't think that logic necessarily is the driving kind of force in a bureaucracy. Assume the opposite. You'll usually be kind of vindicated. That's a terrible generalisation. It's just been, in my experience, it happens too many times.
Yeah, right. Well, just one thing we should ask you before we all go is, there's probably millions of people around the world now who are wondering what's the next project for the bloke who brought them Teacher's Pet.
The Cat Society murders in Brisbane.
Look, there have been some really good ideas raised by other people, that I think could be compelling. I haven't landed on it yet. I want to actually spend quite a bit more time on the Teacher's Pet, because I think there's more there, and I don't want to get distracted before I tie that one up. But I feel like I've been incredibly fortunate in journalism because some of the really exciting stories that have come my way, have made a big difference and have been fascinating for people. And I think that's been one of the great highs of this craft. It's just a blessing. Just the teacher's pet came when I was sort of at a bit of a crossroads in terms of working out what I was going to do in journalism, or whether I was going to try and do something completely different for a while after my dad passed. So wonderful job to have. I'm not great at sort of, working in an office and coming in every day at a certain time, but I'll put in longer hours than just about anyone. And they might be at a coffee shop.
14 series podcasts against 70 million downloads. Just as we wrap, where are Chris and Paul right now? And is that kind of what piqued your interest? Because I heard they were up where you're from. Yeah,
they are. They're at a very aptly named suburb called Runaway Bay, which is on the Gold Coast. Chris usually lives at Coolum on the Sunshine Coast, south of Noosa, near Clive Palmer's Dinosaur Park. But lately he's been spending a lot more time near his brother Paul. I think that they should be worried. The many very serious allegations levelled against them, police will at least be laying charges over the sexual assaults that they're accused of perpetrating. But for Chris, the murder would be a really serious worry, and I believe that it's more likely than not that he would be charged after 36 years, which would be an incredible outcome. But it will give him a chance to finally acquit himself if he's innocent, as he asserts, and he should enjoy, under our legal system, the benefit of presumption of innocence. The problem for him, though, is that these two inquests run by judicial officers who are magistrates have led to him having a presumption of guilt. So he's in this really weird place, and I think a trial before jurors, or if they've all listened to the podcast, which I think is really unlikely, but if they have, to pick up on what you guys were saying before, before a judge alone, would be a good way to finally end this nightmare for Lynn Dawson's family and friends, and for Chris and Paul Dawson's families and friends, and for them.
Yeah, right. Well, we look forward to seeing what happens there. And it sounds like you were the perfect person for it, because you were just young enough to remember it happening, but not yet old enough to have been part of the system that had already failed to cover it anyway. Yeah. So let's just see if the new era of judicial system is onto it.
Great.
All right. Thanks for coming up to the Queensland Desert, mate. It's been an honour to have you up here.
Thank you very much for having me.
No worries.
Let's have a beer.
Yeah.
Okay.